I decided to get away from the busy life in the city, seeking peace and quiet in the woods. The summer was dragging on, and I was starting to feel overwhelmed by the never-ending responsibilities and noise around me. After some searching, I found a small cabin for rent, deep in the forest. It was isolated just how I wanted it. There was no cell service, no internet, and only a dirt road leading to it. The idea of being alone, in a place where I could truly disconnect, seemed like a dream. The cabin was in the northern part of Maine, not far from the Canadian border. It was a rustic wooden structure, built in the 1970s, and looked like it hadn't been updated much since then. The outside was weathered, with peeling paint and a porch covered in moss. Still, there was something charming about it. I figured that it would be a great escape. I was 32 years old, and though I wasn't afraid of being alone in nature, there was a part of me that wondered what kind of things might happen out there. The locals at the small town I passed through on my way seemed nice enough, but there was a quietness to them, an air of unease that I couldn't quite shake off. They didn't ask why I was there, but there was a hesitation when I mentioned the cabin. It was a Friday afternoon when I arrived. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the trees as I made my way up the narrow, gravel driveway. The cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by thick woods on all sides. The only sounds were the wind rustling the leaves and the distant calls of birds. It was serene but almost too quiet. I unloaded my car and set up my things inside. The cabin had a simple layout: one bedroom, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a living room. There was a stone fireplace in the living room with a few chairs around it. The furniture was old but sturdy, and the floors creaked beneath my feet. The windows were large, offering a view of the forest, and there was a thick blanket of trees just beyond the cabin. As I settled in, I couldn't help but feel the weight of isolation pressing down on me. It wasn't that I was afraid of being alone, but there was something unnerving about the silence. There were no street sounds, no hum of traffic, nothing. Just the occasional crack of a branch or the rustle of leaves. It made me feel small and insignificant. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself that it was just the unfamiliarity of being in a new place. I made a simple dinner, something quick, and then lit a fire in the hearth. The warmth from the flames was comforting, and the crackling sounds soothed me. I spent the evening reading a book, but it wasn't long before I started hearing things. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible. I thought I heard footsteps outside, but when I looked through the window, there was nothing. No movement, no sign of life. I dismissed it as my imagination. After all, it's easy to think you hear things when you're in a quiet, unfamiliar place. But the noises continued. It was around 11 p.m. when I heard a thud outside, followed by a rustling sound. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My heart raced, and I found myself holding my breath, listening. The sound of footsteps returned, but this time they were clearer, closer. My mind immediately went to all the possibilities. Was it an animal? Person? Maybe some hikers who had wandered off the trail? I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside onto the porch, scanning the trees for any movement. The light barely cut through the darkness, but I saw nothing. The woods were still, except for the occasional creak of branches swaying in the wind. My breath hung in the air, and I could feel the chill of the night setting in. I stood there for a while, just listening. The rustling had stopped. I shook my head and laughed nervously to myself. I was being paranoid. After all, I was in the middle of nowhere, and there was nothing out here. Just me, the cabin, and the trees. I decided to head back inside, but just before I closed the door, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow darted across the clearing, just beyond the edge of the porch. It was quick, almost too quick for me to fully register what I'd seen. I blinked, but when I looked again, there was nothing. I felt my stomach tighten. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The cabin seemed colder now, the silence heavier. I locked the door behind me and double-checked the windows. Everything seemed fine, but that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind outside, made me jump. Felt like I was being watched. The night dragged on, and the darkness outside seemed to press in on the cabin. The next morning, I tried to brush off the strange occurrences of the night before. I made coffee, took a long shower, and spent the day hiking around the area, trying to shake the unsettling feeling. The forest was beautiful, but it was also vast and isolating. There were no trails, no signs of other people. It was just miles and miles of trees and underbrush. As the days passed, the weirdness continued. I started hearing the sounds more frequently. Footsteps, rustling, things moving in the woods. Sometimes, I'd step outside and find small twigs and branches broken on the ground, as if something had walked through the clearing. I tried to convince myself it was just animals, but the way the sounds came and went felt deliberate, like something was watching me. One evening, as I sat by the fire, I noticed something else. There were no insects around, no mosquitoes, no moths drawn to the light. It was as if the whole area had been drained of life. The woods felt too still, too quiet. It was like nature itself was holding its breath. The next night, I heard a knock on the door. It was soft, almost imperceptible at first, but it was definitely there. Knock, knock, knock. 3 quick raps. I froze, my pulse racing. I wasn't expecting anyone. There was no one for miles. I grabbed the flashlight again and cautiously opened the door, but there was no one there, just the cold night air and the dark woods. I stepped outside, my heart thumping in my chest. The silence was oppressive, and I scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement. I found nothing. It was like whatever had knocked was gone. I felt ridiculous for being so scared, but at the same time, there was a part of me that knew something was off. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed my things, loaded up the car, and prepared to head back to town. As I was walking to the car, I noticed something strange by the cabin's front porch. Marks in the dirt, deep gouges as if something heavy had been dragged across the ground. I followed the marks with my eyes, and they led into the woods, disappearing into the trees. It was then that I realized someone or something had been near the cabin, maybe for days. I didn't stick around to investigate further. I got into my car and drove off, my eyes constantly scanning the woods in the rearview mirror. The drive back to town was a blur. I was shaken, but I didn't feel like I had been in any danger. Whatever had been happening, whatever I had been hearing, hadn't done me any harm. It was just a strange, unsettling experience, but I couldn't deny that the woods had a presence. Something had been watching me, maybe even waiting for me to leave. I never went back to that cabin. I returned the keys, never spoke about the experience, and avoided the area entirely. But as the years went on, I would occasionally think back to that place, the silence, the shadows in the trees, and wonder if I had been imagining things, or if there really was something out there, just beyond the edge of the woods, watching. I had never really thought of myself as the type to go into the woods. Not in the middle of nowhere, anyway. But when my friend Rachel invited me to her family's cabin in the backwoods of Oregon, I thought it might be nice to get away from the noise, the rush of city life, and have a peaceful weekend. A place to clear my head. I didn't expect much. Just some quiet time, maybe a good book, and a few days to catch up with Rachel, who had been living in Portland for the last few years. The cabin was tucked deep into the woods. Rachel's family had owned it for decades, though they rarely visited anymore. The year was 2023, and I was 27 years old. Rachel was a year younger, but we had known each other since college. She had always been a bit of a recluse, and the cabin seemed to fit that. Surrounded by towering trees and thick forest, it was the kind of place where you couldn't help but feel small, like nature was taking up all the space. The only sounds were the wind in the trees, the chirping of birds, and the occasional distant howl of an animal. When I arrived at the cabin, Rachel was already there, unloading the car. She greeted me with a big hug, and I could tell right away that she was excited about the weekend. The air was cold, with a crispness that only seemed to grow as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. I noticed that the cabin itself had an old, worn feel. The wood had weathered over time, with some parts of the porch creaking underfoot. There was a slight mustiness to the air inside, and the smell of aged wood filled the rooms. Rachel led me through the cabin, pointing out where everything was. The main room was cozy, with a stone fireplace on one wall and a few mismatched pieces of furniture scattered around. There was an old record player, and Rachel mentioned that her family used to play music on it when they came up here. A small kitchen sat off to the side, equipped with the basics, and a spiral staircase led up to the loft, which held the bedrooms. Rachel showed me to a small room on the ground floor that I'd be staying in. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A bed, a couple of chairs, and a dresser. There was an old, stained rug on the floor, and the window looked out into the thick woods that stretched for miles. The first night was calm. We had a fire in the fireplace and drank wine, talking about the years that had passed. Rachel told me how much she loved the cabin, but that she hadn't been there in months. Her parents had stopped coming up after they got older, and it had become more of a place for family gatherings than a permanent home. I couldn't help but notice how she seemed a little off. There was a quiet tension in the way she spoke, something unspoken lingering in the air. Still, it wasn't anything I thought too much about. We were just two old friends catching up. The next day, we decided to take a walk through the woods. Rachel knew the trails, and she seemed eager to show me around. We walked for a few hours, breathing in the fresh air, the scent of pine needles, and the sound of leaves crunching beneath our feet. The forest was dense, but the trails were clear, and the further we walked, the more isolated we felt. There was something peaceful about it, but also slightly unsettling. The deeper we got into the woods, the quieter it seemed. The birds, which had been so loud earlier, seemed to have disappeared. As we wandered off the trail, Rachel seemed to get more and more agitated. I noticed her looking around, her steps quickening. "We should probably head back," she said, her voice a little too sharp. I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe she was just tired or anxious, though I couldn't place exactly why. When we finally made it back to the cabin, the sun had started to set. The air had grown colder, and there was a heavy silence that hung between us. We made dinner, but the usual chatter wasn't there. Rachel had become distant, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't want to pry, so I kept to myself, finishing my meal and retreating to my room for the night. The night passed slowly. The wind outside picked up, causing the trees to sway violently. I could hear the occasional creak of the house settling, the fire crackling in the hearth, and the strange noises from the woods. Every so often, I'd hear a distant rustle, like something or someone was moving outside. But when I went to the window and looked out into the pitch-black forest, there was nothing there. It wasn't until the third night that things really started to get unsettling. We had gone to bed early after another quiet dinner. I was half asleep when I heard a thudding noise from somewhere in the house. My eyes shot open, and I lay perfectly still, trying to make sense of the sound. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I listened intently, trying to tell where it was coming from. The sound was faint but distinct, coming from somewhere near the back of the cabin. My mind raced with all the possibilities. Wind, the house settling, maybe an animal? But as the noise continued, it became harder to ignore. My heart started to pound in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I got out of bed quietly, moving toward the door, careful not to wake Rachel. The house was dark and cold, the only light coming from the faint glow of the dying embers in the fireplace. The thudding sound stopped as soon as I stepped into the hallway. A shiver ran down my spine as I stood frozen in place. My ears rang with the silence that followed. I waited, straining to hear anything, but nothing. Then, just as I was about to turn back to my room, I heard something else. A soft, scraping sound, like nails on wood, coming from the very back of the house. I didn't move at first. My feet felt glued to the floor, and my breath caught in my throat. Every instinct in me told me to turn around, to go back to the safety of my room, but I couldn't. Something deep in my gut told me to go check it out. Slowly, I made my way toward the back of the house, my heart hammering in my chest with every step. I reached the doorway leading to the back room. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. The The room was empty, but as I looked closer, I noticed that the floorboards in the far corner were disturbed. There was dirt, freshly scattered across the wood, as if someone had been digging there recently. My mind raced, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was being watched. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to move or speak. The silence of the room was oppressive, and I felt the overwhelming need to leave, to get away from whatever it was that had been there. I didn't wait for anything else. I turned and ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. I tried to calm my breath, to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild, but I couldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something had been here. The next morning, Rachel was already up, packing up her things. She looked pale, her eyes wide and distant, like she hadn't slept at all. When I asked her if everything was okay, she just nodded, her lips tight. There was no hint of the friendly, easygoing Rachel I knew. She was distant, almost as if she were avoiding me. We packed up and left early, and as we drove away from the cabin, I could see her glance in the rearview mirror, her eyes fixed on the woods behind us. I asked her if she was okay, but she didn't answer. She just kept driving. I'll never know what exactly happened in that cabin, or what we heard during those nights, but the feeling that something had been watching us, waiting for us, stayed with me long after I left. I never went back to that cabin, and Rachel, well, I never heard from her again. As I sit here now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. The cabin was supposed to be the perfect escape. I had needed time away from everything: work, people, the endless noise of city life. A few days in the mountains, surrounded by nothing but trees, animals, and the quiet hum of nature. I had rented the place through a website, a cozy little spot in the Adirondacks, in New York. The owner seemed nice enough and everything was laid back. I didn't expect it to be anything extraordinary, just a simple, quiet retreat. I arrived late on a Friday afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the tall pines that surrounded the property. The road to the cabin was long and winding, with only the occasional passing car. The last few miles were gravel, the kind that made your tires bump against the earth as the trees closed in tighter, cutting off the distant view of civilization. I didn't mind. If anything, it added to the sense of isolation I was craving. The cabin was small but charming. Its wood was weathered and aged, the kind that spoke of years and years of standing in the elements. The porch had a couple of rocking chairs, and there was a small wooden sign hanging above the door with the name of the place, Maple Ridge. I unloaded my bags into the cabin and started setting up. The interior was exactly as described. A simple living room with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and a small bathroom tucked in the back. The bedroom had a queen-sized bed with a quilted cover, and a window that looked out onto the forest. It was all so peaceful, so calm, exactly what I needed. The first night was quiet. I made dinner, a simple pasta, and spent the evening reading by the fire. I turned in early, the quiet of the cabin lulling me to sleep. The wind whispered through the trees, the occasional creak of the wooden structure only adding to the ambience of seclusion. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. I had gone for a hike that day, deep into the woods. The path was narrow, overgrown in parts, and the deeper I went, the quieter it became. It felt like the trees were closing in, blocking out the sky above. I didn't see a single soul on the trail, not even a hiker, which was strange given that this area was known for its trails. I had the whole place to myself. I came back to the cabin just as the sun set, feeling tired but good. The hike had been long, and the weather had turned chilly. I started a fire, cooked another simple dinner, and then settled in for the evening. That's when I first noticed something strange. It wasn't the wind or the sounds of animals. It was a tapping, soft at first, like someone was tapping lightly against the cabin's walls. I told myself it was just the trees, their branches brushing against the wood. But the tapping came again, louder this time. I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine. I tried to ignore it, But as the night wore on, the tapping became more persistent. It was coming from somewhere near the back of the cabin. I glanced around, but I couldn't see anything out of place. The porch was empty, and the lights were off in the other rooms. Maybe it was just the house settling, I thought. Old cabins could do that, right? I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but it wasn't working. Every time the tapping came, I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone. I checked the windows, nothing. The door was locked, and I made sure to double-check it before heading to bed. That night, the tapping didn't stop. I tried to fall asleep, but the sound kept me up. I lay there in the dark, listening to it, wondering if I was just being paranoid. But it wasn't just the tapping that bothered me. It was the silence that followed it. After every tap, the night would fall dead still, like whatever was making the noise was listening too. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy feeling in my chest, like something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I told myself to stay calm. It was just the isolation, the unfamiliarity of the place. I decided to go for a morning walk, hoping to clear my mind. The air was crisp and fresh, the trees tall and imposing. I walked down the gravel path that led to a small stream a few hundred yards away, trying to distract myself. As I approached the stream, something caught my eye. There was a patch of disturbed earth, a small hole in the ground, as though something had been dug up recently. It was strange. It didn't look like an animal's work. The hole was too clean, the edges too neat. I knelt down to take a closer look. There was nothing inside the hole now, just loose dirt. But something about it felt wrong. I stood up and quickly backed away, not wanting to linger any longer. The feeling in the pit of my stomach was growing, and I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. When I returned to the cabin, I decided to leave the window open a crack, hoping the fresh air would help. But that night, the tapping came again, louder than ever. Now it wasn't just at the back of the cabin, it was coming from all sides. First the back, then the front, then the side. It was like something or someone was moving around the cabin, tapping on the walls. I bolted out of bed, my heart racing. The tapping was followed by something else now, a dragging noise. It was soft but unmistakable. It was as if something was being scraped across the floor. I grabbed a flashlight and crept out of the bedroom, holding my breath. I walked slowly, carefully, toward the source of the sound. The living room was dark, except for the faint glow of the fire in the fireplace. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood. That's when I saw it. A figure was standing by the window, just barely visible, but it was there, motionless. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to scream, to move, to run, but I couldn't. The figure didn't seem to notice me. It just stood there, staring into the forest, as if waiting for something. I don't know how long I stood there, just watching, but eventually, the figure turned and disappeared into the woods. The dragging noise stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed up and left. I didn't care if the cabin was paid for. I wasn't staying another minute. I grabbed my stuff and rushed out the door, not even bothering to check for my car keys. I just needed to get out. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. The cabin was small, barely visible through the trees. And then, just for a moment, I thought I saw movement. A figure standing on the porch watching me leave. I never went back to that cabin. Something about it stayed with me. An unease, a feeling I couldn't shake. To this day, I don't know who or what was tapping on the walls or what I saw that night by the window. But I learned one thing for sure. Sometimes, the quietest places hide the darkest secrets. I'd never expected to find myself in this situation, alone in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. My name is Mark, and I'm 34 years old. I had always loved the idea of escaping from the world for a while, just getting away from the daily grind of city life. So when I found this remote cabin up in the North Carolina mountains, I thought it would be the perfect weekend retreat. I'd rented the place for 3 days. It was supposed to be peaceful, a time for me to relax, read, and recharge. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, greeted only by the sounds of birds and the rustling of the wind through the trees. The cabin was small but charming, tucked away on a small hillside with a view of the surrounding forest. It had no neighbors for miles, which was exactly what I was looking for. The cabin itself was made of rough-hewn wood, the kind that gave it an old, rustic feel. There was a small porch out front with a couple of rocking chairs, and inside, a stone fireplace that seemed to be begging for a fire. I couldn't wait to light it later that evening, maybe with a book in hand and a glass of wine at my side. Everything about the place was quiet, the kind of quiet that I wasn't used to, but it was exactly what I had come for. I unpacked my things, settled into the cabin, and spent the rest of the afternoon walking around the surrounding forest. The trees were thick, their branches swaying in the wind. It felt peaceful, almost surreal, as if I had stepped into a different world entirely. That night, as the sun sank behind the mountains, I built a fire in the stone fireplace and sat in the rocking chair, sipping on some wine. The flames crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows around the room. The only other sounds were the occasional rustle of the wind and the distant calls of owls. It was around midnight when I heard the first noise. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, or maybe an animal outside. But then it came again. This faint scratching sound, like something dragging along the wooden walls of the cabin. I froze, my glass of wine held halfway to my mouth. My mind raced, trying to figure out what it could be. The cabin was old, but it didn't feel like the type of place that would creak and groan just from the wind. I stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The wind had picked up, the trees swaying wildly, but there was no sign of anything moving close to the cabin. I shook it off. Maybe it was just an animal, a raccoon or a squirrel, getting too close to the building. The noise didn't come again that night, and I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or the house settling. The next day, I decided to go for a hike to clear my head. The sounds from the previous night had bothered me, but I didn't want to let my mind get carried away with paranoia. I took a trail through the woods behind the cabin. The trees were tall and thick, the forest floor soft and damp from the previous night's rain. It was beautiful and quiet, just what I needed. But as I walked, I began to notice something strange. The further I went, the more I started to feel like I was being watched. It wasn't a rational feeling, it was more like a gut instinct. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows behind me. I stopped for a moment, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. The only sound around me was the crunching of leaves underfoot and the occasional bird call. I took a deep breath and started walking again, but the feeling didn't go away. When I returned to the cabin, the unease only deepened. The air seemed heavier, more oppressive. I had expected to be relaxed by the solitude, but instead, I felt increasingly anxious. I didn't want to stay inside the cabin all day, but I didn't want to venture too far into the woods either. There was a strange sense of danger hanging over me, and I couldn't shake it. That evening, as the sun set, I heard the scratching again. This time, it was louder, more persistent. It was coming from the back of the cabin, near the door that led out to the woods. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen and stepped outside, my heart pounding in my chest. The wind had died down, and the night was eerily still. I shone the light around the cabin, moving slowly. I checked the door and the windows, but there was no sign of anything. No animals, no broken branches, nothing. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe there was something under the cabin, something trapped or hiding. But when I knelt down to look underneath, I saw nothing. I felt ridiculous. I stood up, brushing the dirt from my knees, and made my way back inside, locking the door behind me. The scratching continued. I couldn't tell if it was real or just in my head. I started to feel like I was losing touch with reality. Was I imagining things? Was the isolation driving me mad? I spent the rest of the night on edge, every little creak of the house making me jump. I didn't sleep. I just sat in the chair by the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker, the darkness pressing in around me. The following morning, I packed up and decided to leave. I couldn't stay another night in that cabin. But as I gathered my things, something caught my eye. A small object on the floor near the door. It was a tiny piece of wood, no bigger than a matchstick. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. There was something strange about it. It wasn't part of the cabin, I was sure of that. It wasn't from the furniture or the fireplace. It looked like it had been deliberately placed there. My mind raced again. Had someone been inside the cabin? Was someone messing with me? I quickly checked all the windows and doors. Everything was locked, but still, that piece of wood remained on the floor. I stood there for a moment trying to make sense of it. And then, without warning, I heard the sound again. The scraping noise, louder this time, coming from just outside the cabin door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I wasn't alone. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my bag, shoved the piece of wood into my pocket, and ran out the door, heading down the narrow path toward my car. My pulse was racing, my mind still trying to catch up with what was happening. I didn't care about the rest of my things. I just needed to leave to get away from that cabin. I reached my car and slammed the door shut, my hands shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look back. As I drove away, I felt the tension in my body start to ease, the weight of the place lifting from my shoulders. I didn't go back to that cabin. I don't think I ever will. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the thing I'll never forget is that piece of wood. It didn't belong there, and I don't think I was alone in that cabin, not for a single moment. It had been a long day of driving when I finally turned onto the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin. I'd rented it for a weekend, hoping to disconnect from everything for a while. No phone signal, no internet, no distractions. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. I'd been craving solitude for a while, so when I found this place tucked away in the woods, about 30 miles outside of town, it seemed perfect. The sky was beginning to turn a pale orange as the sun started setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the ground. It was late September, the air crisp and cool but not too cold. The kind of weather where you don't need a jacket but feel comfortable in a sweater. I had been driving for hours already, and though the car had been reliable, it felt like the cabin was getting further and further from civilization with every mile. The road became narrower, winding around sharp bends, and the trees grew thicker on both sides. I glanced at the map again. The GPS had long since stopped working when I lost signal, but according to the paper map I'd printed out, I was on the right track. After about 15 minutes of driving down the dirt road, I saw it, the cabin. It wasn't a large structure, but it stood solid against the backdrop of towering pines. Its wood was weathered but still strong-looking, a mix of deep browns and grays. The porch was empty, save for a few old rocking chairs, and a single light above the door flickered as if it had a mind of its own. A couple of steps led up to the door, which was partially open, probably due to the wind. I parked the car, grabbed my bag from the back, and made my way to the cabin. As soon as my foot hit the first step of the porch, I felt it. The quiet. It was like everything had paused. The sound of the wind through the trees, the rustling of leaves, all seemed muted. I'd expected silence, but this was something different, something heavy. I shook it off, thinking it was just the isolation, and pushed the door open. Inside was a small living area with a few mismatched chairs, a simple wood stove in the corner, and a wooden coffee table in the middle of the room. A few framed pictures of nature hung on the walls, though the pictures were faded and looked like they'd been there for years. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I dropped my bag by the door. I looked around, taking in the cabin's rustic charm. The place felt old but well-kept, with a cozy atmosphere that made me think of a simpler time. There was a large stone fireplace along one wall, the kind you'd imagine using to cook a hearty meal or curl up in front of with a blanket on a cold night. The kitchen was small but fully stocked with the basics: a stove, a fridge, some pots and pans. I set about unpacking, putting my things away in the small bedroom that led off the main room. There was a large window above the bed, and I could see the forest stretching out beyond. It was beautiful but also a little intimidating. The kind of beauty that makes you feel small, insignificant even, as though the trees might swallow you whole if you weren't careful. By the time I'd unpacked and had a quick dinner, the sun had completely set, leaving the cabin in near darkness. I lit the fire in the stove and settled into the chair by it, the warmth spreading through the room. Outside, the wind picked up, causing the trees to sway gently. There was something calming about the sounds of the forest, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. I brushed it off as the typical unease one might feel when alone in a place so far from civilization. But as the night wore on, I began to notice strange things. Small things that didn't quite make sense. A slight creak in the floorboards when I was sure I was the only one moving. A gust of wind rattling the door even though I was certain it had been closed tightly. It was nothing major, just little oddities. But they began to add up. Around 9 p.m., I decided to head outside for a bit of fresh air. The air was cooler now, the kind of chill that makes you pull your sleeves down over your hands. I stepped out onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under my feet, and looked out at the forest. The trees were swaying more violently now, their branches bending in the wind. It was a strange sensation, like the forest was alive and breathing with me. I turned my attention to the cabin. There was a light in the window. That wasn't right. I was sure I hadn't left any lights on when I came out. The only light in the cabin had been the one by the door, flickering faintly. But now, there was a steady glow coming from one of the windows, casting long shadows against the walls of the cabin. My heart rate picked up. Maybe I had left something on, I reasoned. Maybe the wind had blown the door open. But as I stood there, staring at the light, I began to feel uneasy. I took a few steps back inside, half expecting someone to be standing in the middle of the room, but the cabin was empty. Just the quiet hum of the fire and the soft ticking of an old clock on the wall. I couldn't explain it. I knew I had locked everything up. I checked the windows and doors again, and everything seemed secure. But still, that light. It seemed like something was wrong. I sat back down by the fire, trying to push the thought out of my mind. It was probably nothing. A reflection of the porch light in the window, or the light from the stove making its way into the next room. But as the night went on, I noticed more and more strange things. The creaks in the floorboards became louder, more pronounced. The wind outside started to howl, and the trees groaned under the pressure. I couldn't ignore it any longer. There was something off about this place. I tried to sleep, but the bed felt uncomfortable, the sheets too stiff. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear something moving outside, the sound of twigs snapping, the rustle of leaves. My mind raced, imagining all sorts of possibilities. Maybe someone else was out there. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. The wind outside seemed to grow louder as the night stretched on, but it wasn't the wind I was listening to. It was the sound of something else, something moving, something that wasn't the wind. I heard it again. The sound of twigs snapping, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the dirt. I got out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer beside the bed and slowly crept to the window. The beam of light flickered across the yard, but there was nothing, just the dark forest surrounding the cabin. I stood there for a long time, my breath shallow, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But something told me that I wasn't alone. Something was watching. The footsteps outside stopped. I waited, tense, listening for any sign of movement. The silence was deafening. Then, the door creaked open slightly, just a hair, as if someone had tried to push it without making noise. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, but my body was frozen. It was too quiet, too still. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to even think about running. Then the sound of something tapping on the window. It was soft at first, like the brush of a leaf against the glass. But then it became louder, more urgent, like something was trying to get my attention. I couldn't make sense of it. My eyes darted around the room, but there was nowhere to hide. I grabbed the door handle and yanked it shut, locking it quickly. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I felt the presence outside. Something was there. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The wind died down, and the night became eerily quiet again. The tapping stopped. The footsteps faded into nothing. I waited, my heart hammering in my chest for what felt like hours before I finally allowed myself to breathe again. The rest of the night passed without incident. I didn't sleep, though. Couldn't. My eyes darted from one corner of the cabin to the next, always searching for something. Couldn't let my guard down. Not after what had happened. When morning finally came, I stepped outside cautiously. The air was crisp and fresh, the sun breaking through the trees, painting everything in golden light. It was as though nothing had happened at all. The cabin was just a cabin. The forest was just a forest. But I knew better. I never did figure out what had happened that night. But I left the cabin the next morning, feeling a sense of relief that I couldn't explain. The drive back was long and quiet, but at least I didn't feel the weight of the unknown pressing on me anymore. I'm not sure what it was. Maybe it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. Maybe I had been imagining things. But something tells me that the cabin knew I was there. It was never really mine to begin with, and I'll never go back. The cabin was isolated, tucked deep in the woods of northern Montana, far from the noise of any nearby town. I had rented it for the weekend, needing to get away from the constant buzz of city life. I wasn't exactly a nature person, but I figured a few days of peace and quiet wouldn't hurt. The year was 2023, and I was 32 years old. My name is Ethan, and I was hoping for some solitude, a chance to disconnect and clear my head after a particularly rough few months at work. The drive up to the cabin was long and winding. My car, a well-worn Subaru, had seen better days, but it was holding up. The road became progressively narrower the farther I went, winding around dense trees that seemed to close in on either side. There were no other cars in sight. The only signs of human presence were the occasional trail markers along the way. I passed a few abandoned houses and a couple of small, run-down barns that had clearly been empty for years. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the ground. The cabin itself looked exactly as I had imagined from the pictures. Small, wooden, with a slanted roof and a porch that creaked when I stepped onto it. It looked like a place you'd read about in a book, tucked away in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place people visit to get away from it all. And I had come for that exact reason. I unpacked my car and carried everything inside. The interior was rustic but cozy. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the smell of old pine filled the air. There was a stone fireplace against one wall, a small kitchen area to the left, and a couple of worn-out armchairs near the window that overlooked the forest. I set my bags down and explored the cabin for a bit. It was exactly what I needed, a peaceful escape. That first evening, I made myself a simple dinner, something quick since I was tired from the drive. The sound of crackling wood in the fireplace was comforting, the only noise aside from the occasional rustle of the wind outside. I sat in one of the chairs by the window, staring out into the darkening woods, feeling the weight of the silence press in on me. There was something almost oppressive about it, like the woods were alive in a way I couldn't understand. After dinner, I went to bed early, figuring I could use the rest. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and I soon found myself drifting off, lulled by the quiet and the warmth of the fire. But as the night wore on, something started to disturb the peace. It wasn't anything obvious at first. I woke up once in the middle of the night to the sound of something tapping against the window. It was faint, almost like the branches of a tree were brushing against the glass, but it didn't sit right with me. There were no trees close enough to the cabin to be doing that. I brushed it off as just my mind playing tricks on me. The tapping came again. This time it was louder. I pulled the covers off and swung my legs over the side of the bed, standing up and moving to the window. The moonlight bathed the landscape outside, but there was nothing there. No branches, no animals, no movement at all. Just the trees, still and silent. I didn't know why I had such a strong feeling of unease, but I couldn't shake it. I stood there for a while, staring out into the woods, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. Eventually, I returned to bed, though I didn't sleep well for the rest of the night. The next morning, I decided to go for a hike. Felt like the right thing to do to clear my head. The weather was cool but pleasant, the sun filtering through the trees in soft rays. I took a trail that seemed to wind around a creek. I figured I'd explore a bit before heading back to the cabin. As I walked, I kept hearing faint noises in the distance. Twigs snapping underfoot, leaves rustling. But when I stopped to listen, it would always go quiet. It was starting to get under my skin. I had this growing sense that I wasn't alone in the woods, that someone was out there watching me. Every time I turned around, I half expected to see someone behind me, but there was never anyone there. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the isolation playing with my nerves. I spent the rest of the day walking around the area, taking in the beauty of the forest, the quiet majesty of it all. But even then, something was nagging at me. A few times, I caught movement from the corner of my eye, just glimpses of shadows darting between trees. But when I turned to look, nothing was there. As the sun began to set again, I made my way back to the cabin, eager to get inside and relax. But as I approached, I noticed something strange. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar. It hadn't been like that when I left, and I was sure I had locked it behind me. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. The inside was just as I had left it. Everything seemed normal, nothing was out of place. But the feeling of unease had intensified. The silence now felt oppressive, like something was waiting, just out of sight. I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin. I stepped outside and circled the building slowly, my eyes scanning the woods around me. Nothing. The trees stood still, the wind barely rustling the leaves. I went back inside, locked the door, and bolted the windows just in case. That night, I didn't bother with the fireplace. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling restless. The tapping started again, this time louder, more insistent. It wasn't the wind. This was something else, something deliberate. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I was just getting paranoid. But the noise continued, rhythmic and steady, like a slow, deliberate knock. I finally got out of bed and moved toward the window, trying to steady my breath. I pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside, but there was nothing there. The night was still, the trees unmoving, no one in sight. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and tried to call the cabin owner, but there was no signal out here. I was completely cut off. My heart was racing. The tapping didn't stop. It felt like it was getting closer, moving around the cabin. I sat back down in the chair, pulling my knees up to my chest, trying to breathe deeply. I stayed that way for hours, just listening to the noise. It wouldn't stop. At some point during the night, the tapping stopped. But the silence that followed felt even more unnatural than the noise had. Couldn't sleep, couldn't think. Every creak of the cabin, every distant sound from the woods, set my nerves on edge. When dawn finally came, I was exhausted but determined to leave. I grabbed my things, hastily packed the car, and locked the cabin behind me. The drive back down the winding road was long, and for the first time in days, I felt a sense of relief. The further I got from the cabin, the lighter I felt. As I neared the highway, I glanced at my rearview mirror and saw the faint outline of something in the distance, standing still near the edge of the trees. I didn't stop to investigate. I just kept driving. I would never return to that cabin, and I don't think I'll ever be able to fully explain what happened there. I only know one thing for sure. Sometimes, when you're alone in a place like that, the silence isn't always empty. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a break from the usual noise of city life. The cabin, a small, secluded structure nestled deep in the woods of Oregon, was exactly what I needed. No distractions, no demands, just me and the quiet wilderness. I had found it online, tucked between towering pines and a gentle stream. The listing had promised seclusion, peace, and the perfect escape. I had arrived at the cabin around noon on a crisp October day. The sun was hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows over the forest floor. The air smelled fresh, like earth and pine needles. The road leading to the cabin had been narrow and winding, barely wide enough for my old Subaru. I couldn't help but think how easily I could have missed the turnoff, hidden among the dense trees. The cabin itself was small, made of weathered wood that seemed to blend into the surroundings. It looked old, but sturdy, with a stone chimney and a small porch that wrapped around one side. It had no electricity, no Wi-Fi, no distractions. Just the hum of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustling of animals in the underbrush. I liked it. I unloaded my things, bringing in a few bags, a cooler with food, and a backpack full of books. I planned to spend the next few days doing absolutely nothing. I had stocked up on supplies, snacks, canned food, and a couple of bottles of whiskey. It was just me and the forest. That was all I needed. As I stepped inside, the scent of old pine filled the cabin. It was cozy, though a bit dim. There was a fireplace in the center of the room, a sturdy wooden table, and a few mismatched chairs scattered around. The kitchen was simple, just a few shelves and a small wood-burning stove. A couple of windows looked out into the forest, offering a clear view of the trees stretching far into the distance. I could already hear the faint sound of a stream in the distance. After settling in, I spent the afternoon unpacking, stacking some firewood in the corner, and getting familiar with the place. There was a small bathroom off the back, with a wooden tub that had seen better days. The sink had a cracked mirror above it, and the water came from a well outside, which I would need to pump by hand. It wasn't fancy, but it was comfortable enough. By the time evening rolled around, I had lit a fire in the stove, set up a few candles around the room, and opened a book. The cabin felt warm and inviting, despite the creeping chill that had settled outside. I poured myself a drink and watched the flames dance in the fireplace, listening to the occasional crack of the logs as they shifted. Night fell quickly, the forest outside growing darker with each passing minute. I could hear the sounds of animals moving through the brush, but there was nothing unusual, just the natural hum of life in the woods. I finished my drink and decided to turn in early, wanting to wake up to the crisp morning air and start my days of solitude. I slept soundly, the quiet of the cabin wrapping around me like a blanket. There were no city sounds to disturb my sleep. No cars, no honking, no chatter. Just the soft rustle of leaves outside and the faint sound of the stream. It was peaceful. The next morning, I woke to the smell of fresh coffee, the sunlight streaming through the small kitchen window. I got up, stretched, and made my way to the stove. The world outside was still cool, but the sun was climbing in the sky, promising a beautiful day. I took a deep breath and went outside to grab some firewood. The cabin sat at the edge of the forest, and beyond the clearing where it stood, the trees thickened, forming an almost impenetrable wall of green. The woodpile was stacked next to the cabin, and I grabbed a few logs, stacking them on the porch before heading back inside. As I carried the wood, something caught my eye. A trail of broken branches, leading deeper into the forest. It was strange. The trees here were thick and old, the forest dense. There were no signs of any real human presence, except for the faint trail, which looked like someone or something had trampled through. But that didn't make sense. The cabin was supposed to be isolated, far from any other homes or roads. I shook off the feeling of unease, telling myself it was just an animal. After breakfast, I decided to explore a bit. I grabbed my backpack and set off down the trail, curious about where it led. The forest was thick with pine and fir, and the ground was soft underfoot. The sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. It was quiet, almost too quiet. There was no sign of any animals, no birds chirping, no squirrels scurrying, just silence. The trail wound through the woods, twisting and turning as it followed the contours of the land. I walked for a while, the cool air filling my lungs as I moved deeper into the trees. The further I went, the stranger the forest seemed. The silence was suffocating, and the trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead. The air felt thick, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. Eventually, the trail ended at a small clearing. There, in the center of the open space, was a large, old stump. It looked out of place, like it had been there for decades. But what caught my eye wasn't the stump. It was the pile of rocks, neatly arranged in a circle around it. The rocks were placed carefully, as if someone had arranged them deliberately. But why? Who would bother? A chill ran down my spine. The feeling of being watched washed over me, and I turned quickly, scanning the forest behind me. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I took a few steps back, glancing one last time at the clearing before heading back to the cabin. That evening, I tried to shake off the odd feeling I had gotten earlier. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, that I was imagining things. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves outside and causing the trees to sway, but nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. It was as if the forest was hiding something I wasn't meant to see. The next day, I decided to leave the cabin behind for a while. I had the feeling that something wasn't right, and I needed to get away for a bit. So, I packed up a small bag with some snacks, my phone, and a flashlight just in case. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I needed to clear my head. I walked along the same trail, trying to put distance between myself and the strange stump and rock circle. The woods seemed even quieter today, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I hiked for hours, not paying much attention to where I was going. I just wanted to be far from that cabin, far from the unsettling feeling that had settled in my chest. But as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, I realized I had wandered much farther than I had intended. I was lost. I didn't panic. I had been hiking before, and I knew that if I retraced my steps, I would eventually find my way back. But the longer I walked, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees were different, the underbrush thicker. And then, just as I thought I recognized a familiar landmark, I heard something. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder, footsteps, soft but deliberate, moving in sync with mine. I stopped dead in my tracks. The footsteps stopped too. I took a slow step forward. The footsteps followed. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. Someone or something was out there. It was late October, just a few days before Halloween. I'd been feeling the weight of city life pressing down on me for too long, so I decided to get away. I wasn't much of an outdoors person, but something about the idea of a remote cabin in the woods, far from anything, seemed like the perfect escape. I found the place on a small, barely used website. It was cheap, which should have been my first red flag, but at the time I was just looking for somewhere quiet to think. The cabin was located near a small town called Grimsford. The town was barely a blip on the map, not much more than a few scattered homes and a general store. From what I could gather, it had a rich history dating back to the early 1800s, though the cabin itself was only about 40 years old. Still, the idea of a place tucked in the woods with a bit of history to it intrigued me. The cabin was set up on a secluded patch of land surrounded by thick pine trees. The road to it was bumpy, a gravel path with ruts that made my car bounce in the most uncomfortable way. When I finally pulled up, the place looked exactly like I expected. A simple, wooden structure with a porch that creaked under the weight of years. The door was a faded shade of brown. The windows were cracked with age, and the overall feeling of the place was a mix of charm and neglect. I unloaded my things, grabbed a bottle of water from the trunk, and stepped inside. The smell of dust and old wood hit me immediately. The interior was sparse, just a couple of chairs, a small table, and a wood-burning stove. There was a worn-out couch, and the walls were lined with thick wooden beams. The floor was creaky beneath my feet, and I could feel the chill of the air seeping through the thin walls. A large window overlooked the forest, giving me a beautiful yet unsettling view of the dark trees stretching as far as the eye could see. I didn't mind the rustic feel, but the silence was overwhelming. There wasn't a sound, not even a breeze rustling the leaves outside. It was as if the whole world had gone still. After a long drive, I was exhausted, so I tossed my bags onto the couch, made myself some tea, and just sat there for a while, staring out at the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though. The trees, their dark branches twisted in odd directions, seemed to loom a bit too much. The shadows stretched far too long, but I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. It was too quiet. As evening fell, I lit a fire in the stove. The warmth was a relief against the cool, biting air outside. I made myself dinner, something simple and ate slowly, taking in my surroundings. Afterward, I grabbed a book off the shelf, but the words blurred in front of my eyes. My mind kept wandering, and my nerves were starting to get to me. I decided to go to bed early. The bed was small, and the blankets smelled faintly of mildew, but it was fine. The night grew colder, and the fire in the stove was dying down. I could hear the crackling of the embers as I tried to drift off to sleep, but the silence outside felt different now. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive. The wind outside had picked up, and the trees started to creak and groan. Then I heard it. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable. A soft, scraping sound coming from outside. My mind tried to make sense of it, but there was no logical explanation. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound stopped. I tried to go back to sleep, but the feeling of being watched crept in again, this time even stronger than before. I pulled the covers tighter around me, trying to ignore the feeling in my gut. Suddenly, the scraping noise came again, louder this time. It was as if something was dragging across the wooden porch. My heart skipped a beat. Was it an animal? The thought made me feel foolish, but the sound was too deliberate, too methodical. I got out of bed and grabbed a flashlight. I stood still in the dark room for a long moment, listening. The wind howled outside, but the scraping continued. I hesitated, then made my way to the front door. The moment I touched the handle, I froze. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but it wasn't this, nothing at all. The porch was empty. I shined the flashlight around, but I couldn't see anything. The door creaked behind me as I swung it back closed. I locked it and stood there for a moment, catching my breath. It was just an animal, I told myself. Probably a raccoon or some small creature dragging something across the porch. But even as I thought that, I knew it didn't feel right. I returned to the bed, trying to sleep again, but I kept hearing things. The wind seemed to pick up, howling louder outside. But then there were those subtle sounds. Scratching at the windows, a soft tap 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 at the door. I tried to tell myself it was just the storm, the trees, or maybe even the house settling, but deep down I wasn't convinced. Felt wrong. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy and restless, the shadows of last night still fresh in my mind. The sun had risen, but the sky was overcast, a thick layer of clouds hanging low above. I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The woods were still eerily quiet, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was just out of sight, something watching me. I walked for an hour, taking in the fresh air and trying to ignore the knots in my stomach. Eventually, I stumbled across a small clearing, and in the center of it was something unexpected. An old, rusted car. The car was half buried in the undergrowth, its body faded and scratched by years of exposure. It had clearly been here for decades. I approached it cautiously, examining the broken windows and peeling paint. I wasn't sure why it unsettled me, but it did. It was as if it shouldn't be here. Something about it didn't belong. I pulled my eyes away and turned to head back to the cabin, but then I heard something. A snap of a twig, followed by a soft crunch of leaves. My blood ran cold. I froze, listening. Nothing, just the wind. I hurried back to the cabin. My nerves were shot and I didn't feel like sticking around much longer. I packed my things, ready to leave the cabin and the odd, unsettling feeling behind. But as I was loading my car, I saw something strange. A shadow moving in the trees, just beyond the line of sight. I turned to look, but whatever it was had disappeared. I got in the car and drove off without a second thought. The whole experience felt like a blur, a nightmare that I couldn't shake off no matter how hard I tried. And as I drove away, I realized just how quiet it had gotten again. Too quiet. When I returned home, I tried to put the experience out of my mind, but the memory of that odd, rusted car and the strange, scraping noises kept haunting me. It wasn't until months later, when I came across an old newspaper article about Grimsford's history, that I learned the truth. The article talked about a man who had gone missing from that area years ago. His car had been found abandoned in the woods, just a few miles from the cabin. No one had ever found him. They speculated he had gotten lost or had an accident, but the search turned up nothing. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the scraping sounds on the porch, the shadow in the woods, it all made sense now. That man who had disappeared without a trace had likely been out there in the woods, just like I had. Only he hadn't made it out. It was late October when I found myself heading to that cabin in the middle of nowhere. I had been searching for some time for a remote place where I could get away from the noise of everyday life. Life in the city had been weighing on me. Too many people, too much traffic, the constant hum of a place that never seemed to rest. I was looking for silence, and a small cabin located deep in the woods seemed like the perfect escape. I rented the cabin online, not asking too many questions. The website description seemed basic, but the pictures looked idyllic. Wooden walls, a fireplace, and views of thick forest as far as the eye could see. It had been a month of vacation, and the thought of spending the days hiking, reading, and reflecting on life seemed like just what I needed. I was in my early 30s, named Tom, and I had been living in Portland, Oregon for a few years. The cabin was located about 2 hours outside of town, somewhere along the Columbia River Gorge, far from any other houses or roads. The place had been rented out by a guy named Jack, who was apparently the caretaker, but he lived an hour away, so I'd be alone for most of my stay. The weather had already turned cool, and the trees were shedding their leaves, blanketing the forest floor in an endless array of golds and reds. As I drove toward the cabin, the air felt heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. The further I drove, the less civilization I saw. It was just winding roads, dense woods, and the occasional wildlife darting across the road. It was beautiful, but a bit isolating. By the time I arrived at the cabin, dusk had already started to set in. I parked my car in front of a small wooden structure, and it looked just like the pictures, maybe even better. The cabin had a rustic charm to it, with its steep roof and large stone chimney. I grabbed my bag from the trunk, looking around. There were no other cabins in sight, no roads, no people, just wilderness. I opened the door with the key Jack had left for me under the welcome mat. The door creaked loudly as it opened, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was inside. The kind of silence that felt almost thick, like the sound of the world itself had been swallowed by the trees. The cabin was cozy, small but functional. It had an old-fashioned wood stove in the corner, a sturdy-looking wooden table, and a sofa covered in plaid fabric. The kitchen was basic, just a stove, fridge, and sink, but the windows offered a perfect view of the forest outside. It was exactly what I had wanted. I spent the next hour unpacking, setting my things in the bedroom, and starting a fire in the stove. The warmth from the fire spread through the cabin, making the air feel thick with comfort. I had planned to just relax that evening. Maybe read a book, have some dinner, and just enjoy the solitude. I didn't have much of an agenda except to enjoy the peace. As night fell, I noticed something strange. There was no noise. No noise at all. Usually, even in the woods, you'd hear something, the occasional bird, the wind rustling through the trees, maybe even an animal in the distance. But here it was dead silent. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, nothing. I shook it off, figuring it was just how remote the cabin was. After all, I was a couple hours outside of town, and the forest was thick. Maybe there wasn't much wildlife nearby, or they were all just huddled in their dens for the night. But then, around 9 p.m., I heard a noise. It was faint at first, like a tap, tap, tap on the wooden side of the cabin. I stood still, holding my breath, listening carefully. The sound was irregular, almost like something was gently knocking on the wood. I looked out the window. Nothing. I tried to ignore it, but the tapping continued for a while, always in the same rhythm. After about 15 minutes, it stopped. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, though. The cabin felt even more isolated now, and I found myself checking the locks on the doors and windows just to reassure myself. I managed to sleep that night, though fitfully. The wind howled around the cabin, and I thought I heard the tapping again at some point, but by the time I would have gotten up to check, it was gone. The next day, I decided to get out and explore. I grabbed my backpack, threw on my boots, and set off into the forest. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched beneath my feet as I made my way through the trees. The silence was still present, but it didn't feel as oppressive now. I walked for hours, not seeing a single soul. The trees were so thick in places that it felt like I was walking through an endless maze. By mid-afternoon, I decided to head back to the cabin. When I arrived, I felt a small wave of relief wash over me. The cabin was exactly how I had left it. No signs of tampering, nothing unusual. That night, the tapping started again. This time, I couldn't ignore it. It was louder now, more insistent. Tap, 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 like someone was trying to get my attention. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and opened the door. I scanned the area with the beam of light, but there was nothing. No one in sight. The forest was still and dark. I closed the door and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping didn't stop, though. It went on for what felt like hours. I was on edge, not knowing whether I should leave or wait it out. I didn't want to confront whatever was out there, but the silence was starting to feel more threatening than comforting. I decided to call Jack. He didn't answer. I left a voicemail, not really expecting a response. The tapping stopped around midnight, and I managed to fall asleep despite my nerves. The following day, I made sure everything was secure before I left. The tapping had stopped, but there was still a lingering unease in the back of my mind. I didn't know what had caused it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. It was irrational, I knew that, but I couldn't help it. I didn't go back into the woods after that. Instead, I stayed close to the cabin, reading by the fire and trying to distract myself. It wasn't until the third night, when the tapping started again, that I realized I wasn't alone. This time, the tapping was accompanied by something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as if someone was pacing around the cabin. I held my breath and listened, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and then I heard something scrape along the side of the cabin, like something heavy dragging along the wood. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The operator answered quickly, and I told her my situation. I was given a reference number, but no help was immediately available. I didn't want to wait. I felt the need to leave, to run. I grabbed my things and bolted out the door, making sure to lock it behind me. The night air was cold, and the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. I ran to my car, adrenaline pumping, and drove off as fast as I could. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me until I reached the nearest town, hours later. When I finally stopped and checked my phone, I had a message from Jack. He apologized for not answering my calls, saying he had been in town. He didn't mention anything about the noises, but he offered to refund me for the remainder of my stay if I wasn't comfortable. I never went back to that cabin. In fact, I never went back into the woods at all. The peace I had been looking for came at a cost I wasn't prepared to pay. The isolation, the silence, and the strange noises. It was too much. The memory of those footsteps, the scraping sound, and the feeling that I wasn't alone lingered with me long after I left. But I did leave, and that's what mattered. I didn't need to confront whatever it was that had been out there. I learned something in those few days, that sometimes the most important thing is knowing when to walk away. The drive up to the cabin was longer than I expected. It wasn't the kind of place you could easily get to. Even though my GPS kept insisting that I was getting closer, the roads seemed to twist and bend further into the woods. The further I drove, the fewer signs of civilization there were. I hadn't seen another car in the last 20 minutes. Not a soul in sight. I had rented the cabin for a weekend getaway, something to disconnect from the chaos of the city. The place was supposed to be peaceful, surrounded by trees and nature, tucked away in a small mountain town in northern Idaho. I was looking forward to the silence, a break from everything that had been weighing on me for the past few months. But as I turned onto the last stretch of road leading to the cabin, something about the place felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it exactly, but the stillness in the air was unsettling. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I was relieved to see it standing there, an old wooden structure with a small porch and a few windows. It looked exactly like the photos. The woods around it were thick, casting long shadows, but the cabin itself seemed sturdy enough, tucked back between a couple of tall pines. The sun had just started to dip below the horizon, and there was a faint chill in the air that made me zip up my jacket as I grabbed my bags from the car. The cabin was locked, but there was a key hidden under the doormat, just like the owner had said. I stepped inside, the wooden floors creaking under my weight. The place smelled like pine and dust, and the faint scent of something else, something old. The living room had a couch, a fireplace, and a small dining table. There was a kitchen off to one side, and a staircase that led up to the second floor. The entire place had that weathered charm, like it hadn't been touched in years, but there was something comforting about it, too. The crackling of the fire would be enough to warm the place up, I thought. Maybe a good book, some hot coffee, and I'd finally be able to relax. I settled in, unpacking my things and lighting the fire. The warmth quickly spread, and I could already feel the tension in my shoulders begin to loosen. I sat down on the couch and stared out the window, watching as the trees swayed gently in the evening breeze. It was peaceful, quiet. I felt like I could finally breathe. But then I heard something, a soft noise coming from upstairs. I froze. I wasn't imagining it. It was a light thump, almost like someone had shifted upstairs. I wasn't sure if I should investigate or ignore it. Could be nothing, right? Maybe it was just the house settling, old wood creaking under the weight of time. That was probably all it was. But the sound came again. Another thump. This time it sounded like footsteps. I stood up and slowly made my way to the bottom of the stairs. I felt silly now, wondering if maybe I had just heard something outside and let my mind run wild. I wasn't used to being alone in places like this, and maybe that was all it was. A trick of the mind. I called out, "Hello!" Nothing. I took a step forward, my heart beating a little faster than usual. I knew I had rented the cabin by myself, but the thought that there might be someone else here made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Slowly, I climbed the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The landing at the top of the stairs was dimly lit by a small light, and it led into two rooms. I could hear the faint sound of something shuffling inside one of them. I took a deep breath and reached for the door handle of the room where the noise had come from. Then, without warning, the door creaked open on its own. My heart skipped a beat. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the room. It was just a simple bedroom, a bed covered in an old quilt, a small dresser, and a nightstand. The window was slightly open, letting in a cool breeze, but there was no sign of anyone or anything inside. The room was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Why had the door opened by itself? Why did it feel like I wasn't alone, even though the cabin seemed deserted? I closed the door behind me and made my way back downstairs, trying to push the unease from my mind. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that everything was fine, but I couldn't help it. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. Every shadow seemed darker than it should be. I tried to focus on the fire, but the crackling of the logs just felt too loud, too overwhelming. The night was long. I managed to get some sleep, though it wasn't the peaceful rest I had hoped for. I kept waking up, the feeling of being watched lingering, like something was just beyond the reach of my awareness. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside. It was bright, and the sunlight streaming through the window made everything look less ominous. I decided to go for a walk to clear my head, to remind myself that there was nothing to be afraid of. The woods were beautiful, the trees tall and dense, the air fresh and clean. I spent hours walking along the trails that wound through the forest, trying to shake off the tension from the night before. When I returned to the cabin, the door was slightly ajar. That was odd. I was sure I had closed it before leaving. My pulse quickened as I approached, cautiously stepping inside. The smell of something cooking lingered in the air, something warm, like stew or soup. But I was alone. There was no one else in sight. I stood in the entryway, trying to decide whether I should go check the kitchen or leave. The feeling of dread was back, stronger now. I wanted to leave, but something told me to stay, to see this through. I turned to the kitchen. The stove was on. The pot on it was bubbling, the steam rising from it. but no one was there. I shut the stove off, staring at the pot for a long time, trying to make sense of what was happening. How had it gotten turned on? Had someone been in here? I checked the rest of the cabin. Everything was as it had been before I left. No sign of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. But that smell lingered. The warmth of the food. The fire crackled in the corner of the living room, as if nothing was amiss. I knew I couldn't stay another night. This was no longer a simple getaway. It was something else, something I couldn't explain. But as I turned to grab my things, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The door to the room upstairs, the one I had checked earlier, was open. Not just a little, but wide open. I was certain I had closed it before. I stood there, my mind racing. I should have left. I should have gone home hours ago. But my feet felt glued to the floor, my body frozen in place. I had to know. I had to see what was in that room. I climbed the stairs again, my legs heavy, each step feeling like it took twice as long as before. The door to the room creaked open with a groan. The room was still empty, but something was different this time. On the floor, in the corner, was a small piece of paper, folded in half. I picked it up carefully, afraid of what it might say. It was a note, a single line of writing. "Leave now, or you'll never leave." The words sent a chill through my body. I stood there, holding the note in my trembling hands, trying to make sense of it. But there was nothing more. No explanation, no context. I didn't waste any more time. I packed up my things, threw them into the car, and drove off as fast as I could. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, but I didn't stop until I was back in town. I never went back to that cabin. To this day, I still can't explain what happened or why it happened. But I know one thing for sure. Some places should remain undisturbed, and some things should never be explored. I had never been the type to get scared easily. The idea of spending time alone in a cabin in the middle of nowhere sounded peaceful, a way to disconnect from the noise of life. So when I saw an ad for a secluded cabin rental deep in the woods of northern Michigan, I jumped at the chance. The cabin was small, with a wooden exterior and a stone chimney, surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush. It seemed like the perfect place to unwind, reflect, and enjoy some solitude. I had been through worse. Camping in the Adirondacks, hiking in the Rockies, surviving some incredibly uncomfortable nights with little more than a tent and a fire. I thought I was used to being alone in nature, but this was different. I arrived in the early evening, just as the sun dipped below the treeline, casting long shadows across the path that led up to the cabin. There was no one around, just the sounds of the wind rustling the leaves and the occasional bird call. The air was cool but not cold, and the smell of pine and damp earth filled my lungs. The cabin was just as described, rustic and charming, tucked away in its own little corner of the woods. I unloaded my bags, setting up inside. The interior was simple, nothing fancy. A stone fireplace on one wall, a small kitchen with old-fashioned appliances, and a couple of worn armchairs near the window. A large wooden table took up most of the center of the room, and the only bedroom was tucked behind a small hallway. I thought I could get used to this. That first night was quiet. Too quiet in hindsight. The sound of the wind outside was constant, whispering through the trees. I stoked the fire, made a simple meal, and settled in for the night with a book. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, but as the night wore on, the silence seemed heavier. It wasn't the kind of peaceful quiet I was used to. It felt almost oppressive. I tried to ignore it, but every now and then, I'd hear a faint crack, like something shifting in the woods, a twig breaking, or perhaps a stone being moved. It was subtle, easy to dismiss as the wind or the settling of the cabin, but the noises grew louder as the hours passed. I convinced myself it was just the house. Houses creak, after all. Trees rub against walls. Nothing to be concerned about. But then, just after midnight, I heard a sound that made me pause. It wasn't the wind. It was a scraping, like something was being dragged across the ground. Slowly, methodically, I froze, my heart pounding. My first instinct was to get up and check, but a strange sense of dread washed over me. It felt like something was out there, something aware of me. I stayed still, listening as the sound faded away into the distance. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I drifted off, I was jolted awake by the slightest noise. The wind howling, the distant rustle of trees. But this time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I forced myself to forget about the noises. Maybe it had been an animal. Something large, maybe a deer, dragging its feet through the underbrush. I went outside to explore the area around the cabin, hoping to clear my head. The woods were thick with trees, the ground soft and spongy from the previous night's rain. I followed a narrow trail that wound deeper into the forest. There was a sense of peace here, but also something unsettling. It felt as though I was being watched, though I couldn't see anyone. I walked for about an hour before turning back, realizing I had gone farther than I intended. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the dirt right by the front door. They weren't mine. They weren't animal tracks either. They were too large, too human, but the prints were uneven, like someone had been dragging their feet. I stepped back, feeling a shiver run down my spine. I had locked the door when I arrived, and the windows were secure. So how could someone have gotten so close without me hearing them? I spent the rest of the afternoon inside, unsure of what to do. The quiet of the cabin felt almost suffocating now. I kept thinking back to the strange noises I had heard the previous night. The dragging sound. It didn't make sense. That night, I locked every door and window, making sure everything was secure before heading to bed. As I lay there in the dark, I kept my mind busy, thinking about anything other than the strange events. But then the sound returned. This time it was louder, closer. The scraping of something against the ground. I sat up, my heart racing. I didn't want to look, didn't want to confirm what I feared, but my curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. There, just beyond the tree line, I saw movement. Something tall and thin, moving slowly through the underbrush. It didn't look right. The figure paused for a moment, then continued, dragging something behind it. I couldn't make out details, but there was something horribly wrong about the way it moved. My breath caught in my throat. I backed away from the window, panic starting to rise in my chest. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my keys, planning to leave, but then I remembered. The car. I had parked it in a small clearing down the road, and the only way to get there was past the figure. My options were limited. I spent the next hour pacing, waiting for the figure to leave or the night to pass. But it didn't. The sounds outside grew louder, closer. The figure was still out there, moving in circles around the cabin. I had no choice. I had to leave. I gathered my things and snuck out the back door, trying not to make a sound. My heart was pounding in my chest as I made my way toward the clearing, praying I wouldn't be seen. But when I reached the edge of the woods, I froze. The figure was standing at the edge of the clearing, facing me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze on me. Something in its stance made my blood run cold. Its posture was unnatural, twisted. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place, rooted to the spot. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me. I don't know how long I stood there, caught in that moment of terror. But eventually, the figure turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing into the night. I didn't wait. I ran to my car, got in, and drove as fast as I could, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. The cabin was miles behind me, and I had no intention of going back. Looking back on it now, I'm not sure what I saw that night. I never found out who or what it was. But I do know one thing: I was lucky to get out. I had always thought of myself as someone who could handle the quiet. That's why, when I saw the opportunity to spend a weekend alone in a cabin in the woods, I jumped at the chance. It seemed like the perfect getaway, away from the noise of the city, the endless work emails, and the constant hum of daily life. The place was tucked away in the middle of a dense forest, somewhere in the mountains of northern Vermont. The cabin, an old log structure with creaky floors and a stone fireplace, looked like the kind of place that had been standing for decades. I'd seen pictures of it online, and it seemed charming. It felt like a good place to disconnect, read some books, maybe do a little fishing by the nearby lake. It wasn't far from civilization, just a short drive, but far enough that there would be no distractions. I was 28, still young enough to seek peace in solitude, but not so naive to think there wouldn't be a little unease being alone in the middle of nowhere. When I arrived, the sun had just started to dip below the horizon. The shadows in the forest stretched longer as I unloaded my bags from the car. The cabin's porch was old, with peeling paint and a few rickety chairs that squeaked when you sat down. It looked abandoned at first glance, but as I stepped inside, I could tell it had been kept up over the years, if not by the owner, then by whoever took care of it before me. The inside was cozy, a couch by the fireplace, a small kitchen with basic amenities, and a tiny bathroom. A large window looked out into the dense trees. Perfect. I'd planned on making a small fire that evening to ward off the chilly air that had started to creep in as the sun sank lower. I spent the evening unpacking, getting the fire going, and cooking a simple dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta with some Jared sauce and a side of bread. It was peaceful. The sound of the crackling fire, the rustling of the wind outside, and the occasional creak of the cabin were the only noises I could hear. No phone calls, no emails, just me and the world outside. I turned off my phone and left it charging in the bedroom. Night fully settled in, and I sat in front of the fire, reading a book I'd brought with me. It wasn't long before I felt the drowsiness begin to take over. I decided to head to bed, stoking the fire one last time before slipping under the covers. I don't know what woke me up, but something jolted me from my sleep. I lay there for a moment, trying to remember where I was, my eyes adjusting to the dark. The cabin was quiet. The fire had burned out, leaving only faint embers glowing in the hearth. I looked out the window. The moonlight barely filtered through the trees, casting long shadows over the landscape. For a moment, everything felt normal, but then I heard it, a soft thud, then another. I froze. The sound was coming from outside the cabin. At first, I thought it could be an animal, a raccoon, maybe, or a deer. The sounds came again, a little louder this time, and closer. Thud, thud, like something heavy was moving in the woods. I lay still, listening, trying to discern the source of the noise. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the squeak of a branch. This was deliberate. My heart started to race. I couldn't tell if I was being paranoid or if something was actually out there. I forced myself to get up and tiptoed to the window, my bare feet feeling cold on the wood floor. I peered outside but saw nothing, just the dark trees, the occasional flutter of a bird, and the faint glint of moonlight off the wet ground. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had to be hearing things. Maybe it was just an animal. I didn't think too much of it, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went back to bed, but sleep wouldn't come easily. The thudding noises had stopped, but a sense of unease settled over me. My mind kept replaying the noise, trying to make sense of it, trying to figure out if I was overreacting. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of damp earth. I stretched, feeling the tension of the night's paranoia still clinging to me. I was determined to not let it ruin my trip. I spent the day exploring the area around the cabin. The woods were thick, the trails were narrow, and everything felt remote. I found the lake a couple of miles down the trail, its surface still and quiet. There was a small dock, but no one else was around. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost too perfect. As the afternoon wore on, I felt myself beginning to relax. The unsettling noises from the night before seemed like a distant memory. That night, I made another fire, cooked a simple meal, and read for a while. The cabin felt warm and safe again, the quiet welcoming. I thought maybe it had just been my imagination running wild, stirred by the isolation. There was no way that whatever had made that noise could still be out there. The night passed without incident. The next morning, I woke early, as usual, to the sound of birds chirping outside. I had a light breakfast and decided to go for another walk. I wasn't sure why, but I felt drawn to a certain spot further into the woods, a little farther than I had gone the day before. I didn't bring my phone or anything with me, just a sense of curiosity that pulled me onward. I followed the trail deeper, the trees growing thicker and the path harder to see. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I drew closer, I realized that there was something in the dirt. A patch of soil had been disturbed, and there were large, deep tracks leading into the woods. They were unlike any animal tracks I'd seen before, large, heavy, almost human-like, but not quite. The footprints led deeper into the woods, and for a moment, I hesitated. I considered turning back, but something told me to keep going, to see where they led. The tracks stopped at the base of a large tree. There was nothing else around, no sign of an animal or a person, just the tree and the disturbed earth. But something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I backed away slowly, my thoughts racing. Who or what had been out here? I didn't want to panic, but the sense of being watched returned. I turned and made my way back to the cabin. Faster now. I didn't feel safe out there anymore, not after what I'd seen. I locked the door behind me and sat by the fire, trying to calm myself down. That night, I stayed close to the cabin. The fire blazed bright and steady, but every creak of the wood and every gust of wind had me on edge. The thudding noise from the first night came back, but this time it was louder. It felt closer, like something or someone was just outside. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer, not sure why, but it made me feel a little better. The noise grew louder, more insistent, until it was right outside the window. I held my breath, the knife trembling in my hand. And then, everything went quiet. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. After what felt like an eternity, I crept to the window again, my heart hammering in my chest. The moon was high in the sky, casting everything in an eerie light, but there was nothing. No figure, no shadow, just the empty forest. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the night, but when I finally turned away, I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I packed my things quickly and left the cabin at first light. The unease I'd felt the past few days crawling under my skin. The drive home felt endless, but as soon as I crossed the line back into the town, I could finally breathe again. I never found out what was out there in the woods or who had made those tracks. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe it wasn't. But that night in that cabin, I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be returning. And I was perfectly fine with that.